Hey, showing up on camera at the start because you have to do that now, apparently. I made all the updated breakdown pie charts for how each country generates their electricity, what percentage they get from what. I won't be going over every country in this video. I will do a lot of them though, but and also, if you want any of these graphs for yourself or access to hundreds of others across all different kinds of similar and other subjects, these are all available in a Drive folder linked in the description under the PayPal and Patreon links. All that stuff's completely free for anyone to access and use at any time. There's no actual paywall in front of it. PayPal, Patreon, etc., YouTube Super, whatever buttons, that's appreciated, but there will never be a paywall in front of anything. Anyways, getting started with the whole world first before moving on to individual countries. So, as of present, as of 2026, the whole world, in terms of its electricity production by source, has declined since the previous year from 34.5% electricity coming from coal down to 33%. The amount generated from natural gas fired power plants has remained the same at 22%. The amount from hydropower from dams has declined from 14.5 down to 14%. The amount from nuclear power has remained the same globally at about 9%. The amount from solar power, both from solar photovoltaic and from solar thermal, has increased from 7 to 9%. The amount from wind has increased over the last year from 8 up to 8.5%. The amount from oil-fired power plants or liquid fuel power plants, as they just lump oil-fired power plants and diesel generator power plants in together, has declined over the last year from 3 down to 2.5%. And just as with last year, 2% is the remainder or everything else now down through the individual countries. Starting with the US, who has decreased over the last year in gas power generation from 42.5 down to a flat 40% of the electricity grid. Nuclear dropped down a little bit from 18 down to making up 17.5%. Coal went back up from 15 up to 16.5%. Wind power stayed the same, providing 10.5% of the electricity. Solar went up from 7 to 8.5%, with 8% being regular and the extra 0.5% being solar thermal. Hydropower stayed the same at 5.5%, and everything else combined is about 1.5%, just as it was last year. China continues declining in coal use, dropping from 58 to 54% as of this year for their electricity generation. Hydropower for them dropped from 13.5 down to 13%. Solar went from 8 up to 11%. Wind went from 10 up to 11%. Nuclear climbed from 4 up to 5%. Natural gas fired power generation continued holding at about 3% of the grid, and 3.5% is everything else put together. India has started falling in its coal use as well, and over the last year has dropped from 74.5% down to this year 71% of their electricity supply. Hydropower has grown from 7.5 up to providing 9% of the power supply. Solar jumped over the year from 6.5 up to 9. Wind from 4 up to 5%. Nuclear from 2.5 up to 3%. And everything else came in at 3% as well. Russia, over the past year, most of their numbers held the same. Early 2025, they were 44.5% gas-fired power generation. Early 2026, they were just a bit higher at a flat 45%. Coal dropped from 18.5 down to a flat 18. Nuclear stayed the same, providing 18% of their electricity. Hydropower dropped a little bit from 17.5 down to 17, and everything else, every other source put together, makes up the remaining 2%. Japan, as of releasing this data, which was at the very start of the year, had dropped from 34 down to 33% gas-fired power generation. Coal had stayed the same at 32. Solar had stayed the same at 10. Nuclear had climbed back up a little bit further from 8.5 up to 9%. However, since then, over the last 5 months, they restarted 2 more reactors, each one about 1 gigawatt or so. And Japan's average power demand load is about 100 gigawatts. So that would be an extra 2% from nuclear. So nuclear is probably around 11 at the current moment. Hydro dropped over the last year from 7.5 down to 7%. Wind stayed the same at 1%, and everything else put together stayed at about 8%. Germany, as of this year, is about 25% electrified by wind power, 19% still coming from coal, 16.5% coming from solar, up from 15 last year, about 15% coming from gas power, 9% coming from biomass power plants, which is usually burning stuff like paper waste or wood waste, leftover stuff from mills, and also collected paper and cardboard and pallets and stuff, as it's actually a more efficient end use to burn those for power generation than it is to actually recycle and reprocess them. 7.5% of Germany's electricity comes from imports from neighbors like France, which was not the case before Germany deactivated all of its nuclear power plants. Hydropower provides about 4%, and the remaining 4% of Germany's power comes from oil-fired power plants or fuel oil burning power plants. Canada this year is coming in at 53% of their electricity from hydropower, 18% from natural gas, up from 15.5% last year, nuclear coming in at 13%, wind power going up from 7 to 8% now, down to 4% from coal-fired power plants, 1.5% from solar, which Canada really shouldn't even be messing around with since they're at such a high latitude, but whatever. And the remaining 3% from everything else put together. Brazil, another hydropower giant, gets just over half, 52% of their electricity from hydropower. They are up to 16% wind power now, up from 14 last year. 12% solar power, up from 10% last year. Natural gas power plants provide about 7%. About 7% comes from burning biomass, 2% from nuclear, and 4% from everything else put together. France is the nuclear giant percentage-wise, getting almost 70% of their power from nuclear power plants, about 10% from hydro. They're up to 8% from wind, 6% from solar, down to 3% from gas, and down to 4% of everything else. Saudi Arabia initially making decent progress in reducing their dependency on oil-fired power generation, has slowed down in that process, but still going down a little bit. Over the past year, they dropped from 32 down to 31% oil-fired power generation reliance. Natural gas-fired power plants went from 65 up to 66% of the grid, and the remaining 3% comes from solar. Mexico, as of this year, is predominantly natural gas dependent, 62% of their electricity supply coming from gas-fired power plants, about 9.5% still coming from power plants burning fuel oil or oil-fired power plants. Hydro providing about 8%, 7.5% from solar, 6% wind, coal dropping from 6 down to 3%, nuclear coming in at 2%, and everything else making up the remaining 2. For South Korea, they are currently 31% coal, 30% nuclear, 28% natural gas, 6% solar, and 5% everything else put together. Indonesia is beginning to dial down their coal reliance for power generation over the last year, dropping from 66 down to 61.5% of their grid. Natural gas coming in at 18.5%. Hydropower providing 7.5%. 6% of their power coming from biomass-fired power plants. 4.5% from geothermal, of which they have several new projects and will be expanding, so that will be going up several percentage points in the next coming years. And the remaining 2% coming from, obviously, everything else all put together. Turkey in present day is 34% coal, 22% natural gas. Hydropower over the last year dropped from 22 down to 16% of their grid, as the drought situation around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers has continued getting pretty bad. They are up to 11% wind power, 10.5% solar, 3% geothermal, and 3.5% from everything else. Vietnam is about half coal powered. They're at 48% coal electricity provision, 33% from hydropower, 7.5% solar, 6% from gas-fired power plants, 4.5% wind, and 1% from everything else. The UK, as of this year, is about 28% gas-fired power, 27% wind, 11% nuclear, 9% dependent on imports, primarily from Norway and France, 6% solar, which they shouldn't be doing stuff with. You're at a high latitude, don't get into this. And then 19% from a broad spectrum of everything else, from biomass to small diesel plants to oil fired power plants to some experimental tidal stuff up in Scotland. Australia is going down coal wise. Over the last year, they went from 44.5 down to 42.5% coal fired power generation. They are at 19.5% solar, 16.5% natural gas. Wind power jumped from 11.5 up to 14% over the last year. 4% hydropower and 3.5% everything else. Italy is, as of this year, 40% dependent on natural gas, 14.5% solar, 14.5% as well of their electricity coming from imports from neighboring countries, 13.5% hydropower, 7% wind, 5% biomass, 1.5% geothermal, and 4% from everything else. Back over in the Gulf, the UAE had already stopped using oil-fired power plants and was predominantly using natural gas. However, now they're also reducing their domestic gas consumption as they've activated their nuclear power plant. So now, as of this year, they came in at 68% gas power, 23% nuclear, and 9% solar. Spain, as of this year, is 21.5% gas power, 20.5% solar, 20.5% wind, 19% nuclear, 11.5% hydro, 1.5% solar thermal, better solar, and 5.5% everything else. Taiwan, as of this year, is 49% dependent on gas power, 36% from coal, 5.5% solar, 4% wind, down to 0% nuclear. They used to have a decent share of nuclear, but they've been shutting down their reactors in anticipation of the upcoming Chinese invasion of Taiwan. 2% hydropower and 3.5% oil-fired power plants. Egypt is mostly gas-powered, just under 80%, with everything else being 7.5% oil-fired power, 6% hydro, 4% wind, and 3% solar. Thailand came in for this year now at 54.5% natural gas, 16.5% of its electricity coming from imports, from primarily neighboring Laos, who consumes so little electricity that it has to actually export most of the gargantuan amounts of hydropower that its dams generate. So 16.5% of Thailand's electricity comes from them, 15% from coal, 4.5% from biomass, 4% solar, 2% wind, and 3.5% hydro. Malaysia is, as of this year, 44.5% coal, 34% natural gas, 17.5% hydro, 2% solar, and 2% everything else. Poland used to be mostly coal, but is continuing to go downwards. Over the last year, they dropped from 53.5 down to a flat 50% coal power. Natural gas went from 12 up to 14. Wind came in at 14%. Solar went from 9 up to 11. 5% biomass and 6% everything else. South Africa continues to be mostly coal powered, and this year came in at 81.5%. Solar came in at 7%, wind at 4.5%, 4% nuclear, 1% solar thermal, and 1.5% everything else. Pakistan is, as of this year, 21% natural gas power, 20% hydropower, 19% solar, 15% coal, 12% nuclear, 9% still oil fired, 3% wind, and 1% everything else. Argentina is about half natural gas power, 52.5% as of this year, 17% from hydro, 12% from wind, 7% nuclear, 4% oil fired, but that's beginning to phase out, 3.5% solar, and 4% everything else. Kazakhstan is about half coal. They're at 54% coal power, just under 30% natural gas, 8.5% hydro, 5% wind, 1.5% solar, and down to 1.5% oil fired. They've almost phased those out. Iran is at almost 90% natural gas power dependent, 4.5% oil fired power plants, 3% hydro, 2% nuclear, and 1% everything else. Netherlands is, as of this year, 35% natural gas, 25% wind, 21% solar, 7% coal, 4% oil fired power plants, 3% nuclear, and 5% biomass. While up across the water, Norway is 90% hydropower, 8.5% wind power, and then 1.5% everything else. Their neighbor Sweden is, as of this year, 40% hydropower, 27.5% nuclear, 23% wind, 6% biomass, 2.5% solar, and 1% everything else. Jumping down across a few places in Africa, Nigeria is almost 70% natural gas. They came in at 69, and the other 31% is coming from hydropower. Kenya, one of my favorites for many reasons, one of which being the fact that they're almost half geothermal, 46% of their electricity, which they are expanding, 21% hydro, 16% wind, 10% still oil-fired power plants, but they'll be shutting those down as they expand the geothermal, 5% solar, and 2% from everything else. Algeria stayed the same as last year, 97% electricity from natural gas and 3% from solar. Ethiopia is almost 100% hydropowered at 96.5%, with the other 3.5% coming from wind. Back up in Europe, Denmark is 58% wind powered, 20% biomass, 13% solar, 4% oil fired, 3% coal, and 2% gas. Belgium is 27.5% nuclear, 18% gas, 16% wind, 16% from imports from neighboring Netherlands and France, and 12% solar, 5.5% oil fired, and 5% everything else. New Zealand is more than half hydro at 55.5% hydropower, 22% geothermal, 1% wind, 9% gas, and 4% everything else. Bangladesh is 55% natural gas as of this year, 18.5% coal powered, 14.5% dependent on imports from India, 10% oil fired power plants, and 2% from everything else. The Bahamas, as they're a set of islands, obviously, they're 99% electricity from smaller diesel power plants and 1% solar as of this year. Afghanistan gets 70% of its electricity via imports through lines across the border from neighboring countries, 22% now from hydropower, 5% from diesel power plants, and 3% from solar. The Czech Republic, as of this year, is 42% nuclear, excellent, 35% coal and decreasing, 8% biomass, 6% solar, 5.5% gas, 2% hydro, and 1% everything else. Over in South America, Peru is 56% electricity from hydro, 36% gas, 3.5% wind as of this year, 3% solar, and 1.5% everything else. Ecuador is 78% hydropowered, 18% from oil fired power plants, 2.5% from natural gas, and 1.5% from everything else. Colombia is almost 70% hydropower, 14% currently from natural gas, 6% coal, 5% solar, 1.5% from imports, and 4.5% everything else. Venezuela is 91% hydropower, seeing a common theme across South America in particular, 4.5% natural gas and 4.5% oil fired. Chile, one of the only ones who actually breaks the pattern, as they're kind of a semi-desert, is 25% solar, only 22% hydropower, 18% coal, 15.5% gas, 13% wind, and 6% everything else. Paraguay is the champion as they are 100% hydropowered. And actually, similar to Laos over in Southeast Asia, they cannot even consume all of the power they generate. So they actually have to export it to neighbors like Uruguay. Turkmenistan over in Central Asia is 100% natural gas powered. Trinidad and Tobago off the coast of Venezuela is also 100% natural gas powered. Somalia used to be 100% diesel powered. However, over the last few years, that has dropped to 79%, and they are now getting 18.5% of their electricity from solar and 2.5% from wind. Back up on the North African coast, Libya is a 3/4 and 1, 75% gas power, 25% oil fired. Tunisia is 85% gas, 10.5% electricity imports over the border grid from Algeria, 2% solar, 1.5% wind, and 1% everything else. Morocco is 61.5% coal, 16% wind, 11% gas, 3 solar thermal, and 5.5% everything else. And then Jordan is 62% gas, 17% solar, 10% wind, and 11% oil fired. Iraq is about half gas powered, 50.5%, 43% still coming from oil fired power plants, 5% from cross border imports, and 1.5% everything else. Qatar down in the Persian Gulf is 96% gas and 4% solar. Kuwait is 62% gas, 36 oil fired, and 2% wind. Oman is 92% gas, 4.5% solar, and 3.5% oil fired. Back up in Europe, Finland is 40% nuclear, 27.5% wind, 15% hydro, 12.5% biomass, and 5% everything else. Romania is 22% hydro, 18.5 nuclear, 17 gas, 12 coal, 11 wind, 9 solar, 9% imports across the grid from Bulgaria, and 1% everything else. Bulgaria is 39% nuclear, 22.5% coal, 18 solar, 6.5 hydro, 5 gas, 4.5 biomass, 3.5 wind, and 1 everything else. Greece is 38.5% natural gas, 22% solar, 20.5% wind, 7% oil fired, 6 hydro, and 6 everything else. Portugal is 24.5% hydro, 22% wind, 16.5% imports from Spain, 14.5% solar, 14% gas, and 8.5% everything else. Hungary is 33% nuclear, 22.5% solar, 18% imports, 16.5 gas, 5 biomass, and 5% everything else. Panama is 58% hydro, 21% natural gas, 10% solar power, 7% wind, and 4% everything else. Just to the north of them, Costa Rica is 75% hydropower, 12% wind, 12% geothermal, and then 1% everything else. Mongolia is 63% coal power, 27% imports, 4% wind, and 6% everything else. And then two neighbors and the world's two primary cocoa producers for chocolate. Ghana is 65% gas power, 33% hydropower, and 2% everything else. And Cote d'Ivoire is 71% gas power, 28% hydro, and 1% everything else. Guatemala is 38% hydro, 21% biomass, 15% each coal and oil fired, 4% imports from Mexico, and 7% everything else. Honduras is a 38% diesel power, 30% hydro, 9.5% solar, 6.5 biomass, 6% oil fired, 6% wind power, 3% geothermal, and the remaining 1% is imports. Back over in Africa again, Angola is just over 70% hydropower, 17.5% oil fired still, 9% natural gas, and 3% solar. Senegal is 60% oil fired, 13% diesel, 9% solar, 6% imports, 5.5% wind, 4% hydro, and 2.5% everything else. Mali is 66% diesel power, 15.5% hydro, 14.5% oil fired, 3% solar, 1% everything else. Niger, just to the east of them, is 60% dependent on imports from neighboring countries, with the remaining 30% coming from diesel power, 7% from coal, and 3% everything else. Myanmar, or Burma, is 46% hydro, 46% natural gas, 5.5% coal, 1% imports, and 1.5% everything else. Cambodia is 42.5% coal, 25% dependent on imports, again from Laos, the overproducer, 22.5% from hydro, 8% solar, and 2% everything else. Nepal is 99% hydro, 1% solar. Azerbaijan is 87.5% gas power, 11.5% hydro, 1% everything else. Ukraine currently is 47% nuclear, 20% coal, 1% cross-border line imports, 7% solar, 1% wind, and 15% everything else. 3 Baltic nations all have some degree of import reliance now on cross-Baltic lines over from mainly Sweden, but also some sharing from Norway into Sweden that then goes across the Baltic subsea lines. Estonia, 35% dependent on electricity imports, 25% oil-fired power plants, 14% biomass, 12.5% wind, 12% solar, and 1.5% gas. Latvia, 38.5% hydro, 21.5% gas, 17% from imports, 11 solar, 8 biomass, 3 wind, and 1% everything else. Lithuania is 32.5% wind, 28% dependent on imports, 13.5% solar, 12% gas, 7% biomass, 4% oil fired, and 3% hydro. Some more randomly selected island nations. The Maldives, a collection of islands, is 93% diesel powered and 7% solar. Jamaica, one big island and a big pile of bauxite or aluminum ore, is 57% gas powered, 15% diesel, 15% oil fired, 6% wind, 3% solar, and 4% everything else. Ireland, another island, is 42% gas, 32.5% wind, 14% dependent on imports, 4.5% solar, and 7% everything else. Switzerland is 52% hydro, 30% nuclear, 12% solar, and 6% everything else. Slovakia is 66% nuclear, 11% gas, 11% hydro, 5 biomass, 7 everything else. Austria is exactly 50% hydro, 13.5% solar, 11.5% gas, 11% wind, 4% imports, primarily from Switzerland, and 10% everything else. Croatia is 36.5% hydro, 20% wind, 17 gas, 8.5 solar, 7% from imports, and 11.5% everything else. Serbia is 64% coal power, 22% hydro, 6.5 gas, 4% wind, 2% imports, primarily Bulgaria, and 1.5% everything else. Back down in South America, Uruguay is almost 30% wind, 28.5% dependent on imports, getting routed down from Paraguay, the overproducer, 19.5% hydro, 18% biomass, 3.5% solar, and 1% oil fired. Bolivia is 62.5% gas fired, 28% hydro, 3% biomass, and 3% solar, and then 2% wind and 1.5% oil fired. Guyana is still 96.5% oil-fired power generation and 3.5% everything else. Tanzania is 61.5% gas power, 31% hydro, 4% oil-fired, 2% imports, and 1.5% everything else. Namibia is 52% dependent on cross-border power lines importing from Angola and South Africa, 30% from hydro, 17% solar, and 1% everything else. The Big Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, is 78% hydropower, 8% imports cross-border, and 14% solar. Belarus is 54.5% natural gas, 36% nuclear, 4% oil-fired, 2% hydro, and 3% everything else. The Dominican Republic is 29% coal, 27% gas, 19.5% oil fired, 10% solar, 7 hydro, 6.5 wind, and 1.5% everything else. And finally, Sri Lanka is 38% hydropower, 27.5% coal, 16.5% solar, 11% oil fired, 5.5% wind, and 1.5% biomass. Okay, I apologize if your country was not on the list, but once I got near or past 100, I started to wear out a little bit. So that's where this is going to end. But several graphs of countries I did complete afterwards but didn't audio record will slowly be playing. Again, you can find all these available for free for you to look at or use or whatever. They're in the drive folder linked in the description. Anything through the YouTube super thanks button, PayPal, Patreon, whatever is helpful, but it's not required. There's no paywall and there never will be. Part of the reason I started the free drive folder thing is precisely because so many websites and news organizations have started putting up paywalls, and I wanted to make sure that there was some variation, some form of data like this constantly available to people for free, even if it's not visually that impressive like you would find on Bloomberg or something, because it's just me putting stuff off of an Excel sheet. But anyways, thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, hundreds of other videos for you to check out if you want. All the support links and everything are down there as well if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's a link in the top end comment to my cat's YouTube channel as well. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.